Hey everybody, and welcome back to Lecture 5 of Philosophy Jam. Let's start this episode by thinking about something I bet you've wondered about. What is it like to be a cat? What would it be like to look out of a cat's eyes, to experience the world as they do? Today's episode is going to go into the philosophical questions that topic raises. Hope you'll join me on today's episode of Philosophy Jam. Of course, we've all had this thought about various animals, right? If you own a dog, I'm sure you've wondered what it's like to be the dog. If you own a fish, you've wondered what it's like to be a fish or a ferret, whatever. And surprisingly, this common daydream has really interesting philosophical underpinnings lying just below the surface. So let's start examining them. According to Wired.com, which cites research done by scientists who concern themselves with cat vision, feline photoreceptors are most sensitive to wavelengths in the blue-violet and greenish-yellow ranges, which means that cats are mostly red-green colorblind, with a little bit of green creeping in. They see colors very differently from us. Secondly, instead of the color-resolving, detail-loving cone cells that populate the center of human retinas, cats and dogs have many more rod cells which excel in dim light and are responsible for night vision capability. So even though cats see fewer colors than us, they see much better at night and in dim conditions. That's why cats are such good hunters at night, and why they can see subtle movements that are undetectable to the human eye in those sorts of conditions. Okay, so maybe that gives us some sort of clue as to what it's like to be a cat, but could science ever tell us exactly what it's like to be a cat? That is, if we knew everything there was to know about a cat brain and cat vision and cat physiology, would we be able to know in perfect and full detail what it's like to actually be a cat? This is a question that philosophers have puzzled over in recent years. Thomas Nagel wrote a very famous paper in the 1970s where he asked, what is it like to be a bat? And this is a really interesting example because bats use a special sonar echolocation sensory system in order to see, in order to locate their prey, and in order to fly around and navigate through the night. Now, this is really interesting because their vision, if it can properly be called that, doesn't operate on rods and cones and light, and it operates on sound. So Nagel posed the question in his paper that I've been posing all along. Could we ever come to know what it's like to be a bat by knowledge of bat physiology alone? That is, could a very well-developed science of bat echolocation come to tell us exactly, in full detail, what it's like to be a bat? Nagel's answer was no. He thought that science works by eliminating the subjective perspective. When we do science, we seek to explain things objectively. We seek to explain them without appeal to a point of view. And so, if we were to scientifically investigate all of these things that relate to bat vision, we would inevitably leave out a really important thing. That is, what it's like from the bat's perspective. Nagel's example of the bat raises one of the most profound questions in philosophy, and in particular in a branch of philosophy called metaphysics. Metaphysics examines the nature of what exists. It asks questions about what kinds of things exist and what their relationships are to one another. So, a central question within metaphysics is the question of how the mind and the body relate to one another. As Nagel's example brings out, it seems to be totally mysterious how thought and consciousness relate to the brain or relate to the physiology of the body. How is it that unconscious molecules arrange themselves together in a special way, namely in a nervous system, such that they give rise to conscious, subjective experience? It's one of the deepest problems in this universe, at least in my opinion. So there are two ways of cashing out this problem and really understanding it in detail. And philosophers of mind and metaphysicians who think about these questions raise them in two particular ways. The first way is to think about thoughts as having intentionality or a sort of aboutness. What that means is thoughts seem to reference things outside of themselves. Right? Thoughts are about other things. I could be thinking about my banjo right now. I could be desiring to go outside and go for a hike. I could be wishing that I hadn't made an awkward remark the other night at the party. All of these examples are thoughts or desires that refer to things outside of themselves. The party, or the banjo, or the hike. And what's strange about this is it seems like purely physical matter can't have this property of intentionality or aboutness. It doesn't seem like purely physical matter can be about anything at all. How can it refer to anything outside of itself? The second way of cashing out this problem is to point to the nature of consciousness. And this is what Nagel's example of the bat really brings out. It seems like consciousness is indescribable in purely physical terms. Another way of putting this is to say that consciousness seems irreducible to purely physical terms or purely physical descriptions. How could I ever describe what it's like to be a bat or what it's like to be a cat in purely physical, neurological terms? It just doesn't seem like I could ever give you a really detailed, full, perfect description of bat echolocation and what that is like if I were to only give you that description in physiological terms or in physical terms. This is the mind-body problem. How do we explain how these mental phenomena, that is, thought and consciousness, relate to physical phenomena like matter and motion? So one answer to the mind-body problem has been basically just to deny it. This view is called mind-body identity theory, or just identity theory. and it asserts that the mind just is the brain, or that mental processes just are physical processes. Another view that we'll be exploring is called functionalism. And instead of identifying mental and physical processes, this view holds that the mind is the way that the brain functions. So that if we have a system that functions like a brain, then it would be conscious in the way that minds are, or it would have thoughts in the way that minds do. So, functionalism points to the particular role that the mind plays. It's a kind of pattern that the brain, when it's functioning, uses to operate. It's a kind of algorithm or a set of inputs and outputs that cause us to behave in certain ways and to respond to stimuli in certain ways. So let's examine what philosophers have objected to in each of these views, because they don't seem to quite adequately answer the mind-body problem. So the first objection to the identity theory is really what I've been reiterating since the beginning of this lecture. The identity theory seems to leave out the conscious experience itself. It seems to leave out phenomenology, it seems to leave out qualia, it seems to leave out subjectivity, feelings. All of these are synonyms that philosophers use to describe subjective experience, to describe what it's like to be a conscious system, which again, on the identity theory, seems missing. Here is perhaps a sharper way to make the point. This is an argument in philosophy known as the knowledge argument, and it was first put forth by a philosopher named Frank Jackson. The argument is against physicalism, which is a thesis in metaphysics which holds that all that exists is physical. So everything in some way, at base, fundamentally, is just physical stuff or physical processes, the stuff that can be described by physics. Physicalism, according to Jackson, seems to leave out phenomenal experience. And he comes to this conclusion by concocting a thought experiment known as Mary's Room. He asks us to imagine a color scientist, Mary, who lives in a black and white room for her entire life. Despite living in this strange circumstance, she is the world's leading expert on color vision. She, in fact, knows everything that there is to know about color vision in the human brain and in human eyes. She knows everything there is to know about the photoreceptors in the human eye, how light hits them, how it is transmitted into impulses in the nervous system and sent to the brain and processed there in the visual cortex. Nevertheless, it seems like when Mary exits her room, her black and white room, she will learn something new about color vision. When she sees a red rose, she will learn what it is like to perceive red from the first person perspective. And even though she knows everything physical about color vision, this fact, the subjective experience of red, will be left out of her knowledge. Even though she's an expert on color vision, she'll learn something new upon exiting the room. Mary's Room, of course, is a philosophical thought experiment, but it's actually not that far from the real world, as you can see in these videos of colorblind people who put on a special kind of glasses that allow them to see color for the first time.
Got a bunch of colors in here, buddy. Can you see it?
Bubba. What can you see, honey? It's okay, talk.
Thank you.
What can you see, buddy?
Color.
Can you see my shirt? Purple?
Okay, put them on now. What?
Look at your case and tell me what color that is.
Wait, are these my color?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. This is red. Oh my gosh. And that's white.
Look at the sign up there. What's that?
And oh my gosh, that's yellow.
Ah, don't go out there.
And this is black. And this is white.
Look at this guy up there. Look at that. What's that look like?
Too much colors for me to really tell though.
Is that a lot of color?
Oh yeah, it's like blue and yellow and red and oh my gosh, oh.
I have gone 65 years without seeing color, and I've seen these videos where people get emotional, and I'm not going to get emotional.
Justice is.
I don't know.
That's green.
It's so clear I can't believe it.
Dad, do you hate it?
So this phenomenon seems to lend some support to Jackson's thought experiment. Of course, these people aren't the world's leading experts on color vision, but in a sense, they do live in a black and white room for their entire lives. They're unable to see color. And of course, it seems pretty real that they're learning something new when they put on these glasses. They learn what it's like to actually see color. And no amount of intellectual, conceptual learning about the physiology of color vision would be able to give them this knowledge, right? So let's return to Jackson's argument. How does this refute the thesis of physicalism? Premise 1 says, physicalism holds that all correct information is physical information. Right? So if everything in the world fundamentally is physical, then information about it must, if correct, be physical information. Okay, that just seems to be an assertion of the thesis of physicalism. Premise 2. Complete knowledge of physical information would not provide someone who had never had the experience of seeing a certain color with knowledge of what it is like to see that color. This premise is supported by the thought experiment Mary's Room, and perhaps it's also supported by the experience of the people I just showed you videos of. Okay, premise 3 says that since 2 is true, there is some correct non-physical information. Or if 2 is true, then there must be some correct non-physical information. This leads us logically to the conclusion that not all correct information is physical information. That is, the people who put on these glasses and Mary, when she exits her room, learn something new that is non-physical. They learn some new truth that isn't captured in physical information. Thus, physicalism must be false. Okay, so maybe these arguments and thought experiments refute the identity theory, that the mind and the brain are identical. So perhaps functionalism, the view that the mind is a special functional set of inputs and outputs that are played by the brain, that special pattern of operation is enough to account for the mind and is enough to explain the mind and the brain's relationship to one another. A philosopher named John Searle called all of this into doubt with a famous thought experiment that he concocted, now known as the Chinese room. We're asked to imagine a room that contains a giant rule book for matching certain Chinese letters with other letters in Chinese. The rule book tells a non-Chinese speaker in the room how to pair certain Chinese symbols with other Chinese symbols. The rulebook is extremely long and complicated. A Chinese speaker on the input side of the room puts a letter into the room. The person inside of the room uses the rulebook to write an output letter based on the input letter. The person in the room, again, doesn't know any Chinese, but just follows the rule book, which is a set of instructions for what symbols to pair with a given input. Once the output letter is created based on the rule book, it's fed through the out slot. The output letter is supposed to be so sophisticated that it would convince the original Chinese speaker who put in the input letter that he is having a conversation with another native Chinese speaker. But of course, he's not. The person inside of the room speaks no Chinese. He's just following the rule book. The person outside of the room thinks that he's communicating with another human being who consciously understands Chinese. Searle says that this is the way the computers work. They operate based on syntactical information, right? They take inputs in and they have a certain algorithm that they use to create an output. And there's no real understanding in a system that operates this way. At least Searle claims. It's just symbol manipulation. Certain symbols come in, and others, based on the input, are fed out. Of course, the computer program will influence what is fed out, but a sophisticated enough program could conceivably have a conversation with a Chinese speaker in such a sophisticated way that it convinces this Chinese speaker that the computer is a person who consciously understands Chinese. But it doesn't seem like this is enough for real understanding or real consciousness, right? So if Searle's right, then it seems like functionalism can't adequately explain the mind, because more is going on in a mind than just pure symbol manipulation. We usually think that minds have a sort of semantic as opposed to a syntactic understanding of the symbols that it takes in. Minds are able to grasp certain things. They're able to understand them consciously. The light bulb turns on, and there's a certain feeling that accompanies this kind of understanding. All of this seems absent in the Chinese room and in computers. Okay, so if identity theory doesn't work because it leaves out subjective experience, and if functionalism doesn't work because function isn't sufficient for consciousness or understanding, then what should our view on the mind be? How does it relate to the brain? Here are two other answers that come from a more mystical angle. The first one was proposed by Descartes. It's called substance dualism. And according to this view, mind and brain are fundamental and different substances. What I mean by this is they're fundamental constituents of the world. They're sort of like the ultimate building blocks from which everything else is created. And they're just completely different. Mind has an internal aspect, it has thoughts, it has consciousness, and matter doesn't have any of that. Instead, it has spatial extension, potentially mass, other physical properties like that. Descartes thought that the essence of mind was thinking, and that the essence of matter was extension. What's a bit strange about substance dualism is that it seems not to fit comfortably within our scientific understanding of the world. It seems to leave room for mysterious entities like the soul. And it also fails to explain how the mind and the body would interact. It seems like an immaterial substance like mind could never causally influence a material substance like the body. But of course, according to common sense, it seems like the mind and the body interact quite intimately all of the time. So an alternative answer is called property dualism, and sometimes it's called dual aspect theory. And what it holds is mind is an aspect of some or all matter. So it's not separate from matter, it's just a kind of feature of matter. It's a property that some matter has, or that all matter has. Panpsychism is the version of this view that holds that all matter, at least in some rudimentary way, is conscious. Now, this may seem completely crazy at first, and that's an often raised objection against panpsychism. But it's in fact my favorite view on offer in answer to the mind-body problem. And it's my favorite not so much because I'm certain that it's true, or even confident that it's true, but I just think it neatly ties up a lot of the gap as compared to the other views. It doesn't posit that all matter is conscious in the way that humans are conscious. Of course, it's not like the molecules in my couch are having thoughts about dinner or dating life or bluegrass music. Rather, it holds that there's some rudimentary way in which these molecules are conscious or proto-conscious. That is, they have the special kind of ingredients that you need in order to build a mind. Again, I know panpsychism sounds like a completely insane view, but the mind-body problem and the problem of consciousness are so mysterious that I almost think we should expect a crazy answer. After all, quantum physics is an answer to problems in physics that's pretty crazy in and of itself. So if our physics is absurd, why not think that our metaphysics could be absurd too? I'll leave you with a quote from the famous psychologist and philosopher William James. It really captures the motivation behind a view like panpsychism. He says, "Consciousness, however small, is an illegitimate birth in any philosophy that starts without it, and yet professes to explain all facts by continuous evolution." What he's saying here is that it doesn't seem like consciousness could ever come from any arrangement of matter, no matter how special or specific it is. Instead, we need to posit consciousness at the very start, at the fundamental level of the universe from which other things are built. On that particularly strange note, I'll leave you. I hope you enjoyed Lecture 5, my series in Philosophy 101, and I'll see you next time on Philosophy Jam.